Someone once said, if you aren't cheating, then you aren't trying. While the morals of that statement may be dubious, these are some of the biggest cheaters in the UFC. Let's start off with the Phenom from Rio, who pummeled opponents on instructions from the Almighty. Armed with 2 cannons for hands and an in-cage intensity at his prime that few fighters can ever hope to match, Vitor Belfort lived up to his nickname. At only 19 years old, the then relatively unknown Rio youngster walked into the octagon at UFC 12, shocking everyone when he viciously knocked out Tra Telkman. Belfort would go on to win the tournament, becoming the youngest UFC champion in history. With a storm of fists and righteous violence, Vitor would go on to maul opponents in the cage for years to come. But this Phenom's reign atop MMA was fueled by more than just his strong religious beliefs. Banned substances haunted Belfort over the course of his long career. The first time he got dinged for using an illegal PED was in 2006, after losing effort against Dan Henderson in the Pride Fighting Championship. Belfort had to watch Henderson's hand be raised before being outed for testing positive for testosterone-enhancing steroids. According to him, it couldn't have been him, but instead, some shady supplements were to blame. After all, he was a godly man, and godly men don't cheat. A once-in-a-generation talent, Vitor Belfort would go on to have legendary feuds with the likes of Tito Ortiz, Anderson Silva, and Michael Bisping. Most of us are self-conscious about our weight, but for the modern-day gladiators of the UFC, a lot more than self-esteem is on the line. Making weight is a vital step on the path to stepping into the octagon. Fights have been canceled days before, simply because someone couldn't shed a few extra pounds. Failing to make weight can put a stain on a fighter's exemplary record. But if you asked former champion Daniel Cormier, trying to cheat the scale can make matters much worse. The image is infamous. There's light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier at his weigh-in for UFC 210. In the nude, his modesty protected by a towel adornment with the UFC logo. He appears to make weight. That is, if you weren't watching closely. You see, not long before, Daniel Cormier went through a strenuous weight cut in training camp. The first time around, the scale confirmed what his team feared. The champ was over the 205-pound limit for his bout with Anthony Johnson. With so much money, respect, and his title on the line, Cormier and his team appealed for a second attempt. This time, Cormier stripped, shedding those extra pounds in the form of his clothes. Surely that wouldn't have been enough. When Daniel Cormier stepped on the scales for the second time, this time, behind that seemingly magic towel, he made 205. How could this happen? Eagle-eyed viewers flooded the internet with the #1 theory as to how Daniel Cormier's clothes weighed so much. Chances are, you've already surmised that clothing had nothing to do with it. By his own admission, years later when he was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, Daniel Cormier cheated to make weight that night. Cormier said his coach had an idea. It wasn't to not lose the 1.2 pounds Cormier needed to lose in order to make the 205-pound limit. Instead, the wily wrestling veteran suggested he used a little trickery while on the scale. Cormier said his coach suggested that if he stripped, the officials would have to use a towel to cover up his naughty bits. That towel would have to be held taut, giving the light heavyweight champion the perfect opportunity to grab it, alleviating just that little bit of weight he needed the scale to miss. Voila! Towelgate was born. No one will ever look at naked weigh-ins the same again. It's not unusual for even the greatest fighters to do whatever is necessary to gain an advantage. Catching these rule breakers can be slippery to say the least. In 2009, the UFC was still growing into the sporting giant it is today. One of the biggest bouts in the company's young history was the highly anticipated match between Georges St-Pierre and BJ Penn at UFC 94. After the first round, all signs pointed to the fight living up to all the hype. Neither fighter backed down. By all accounts, the bout seemed to be pretty even. But then, both fighters returned to their corners before the start of the second round, and eyebrows started raising. It's well within the rules of MMA and most combat sports for cornermen to apply Vaseline to their fighters' faces. This isn't a kind gesture to keep their man's skin moisturized. Vaseline can help prevent cuts and stop them from bleeding. What became controversial wasn't the use of Vaseline, it was where it was applied. BJ Penn's team accused St-Pierre's team of rubbing grease on his back and shoulders. This isn't just because it's gross to grapple with a greased opponent, it makes them too slippery and hard to grab a hold of. In a sport where getting your hands on your foe is important, turning yourself into the human equivalent of a greased pole is generally frowned upon. BJ's legs and arms slipped and slid all over Georges St-Pierre's body, leading to a messy, lopsided victory. For all his accolades, the accusations of St-Pierre being a slick operator on more than one occasion continued as a black eye on an otherwise stellar career. One figure in the history of the UFC stands out from the crowd in the best and worst possible ways. He's considered by many to be the greatest fighter of all time, while at the same time being seen as one of the biggest screw-ups in the sport's history. We're of course talking about the great, the legendary, the cheater, Jon "Bones" Jones. The long list of Jon Jones' sins start with his conduct in the octagon. It began with Jones' first loss. The young fighter employed the very dangerous 12-6 elbows on his opponent, which are banned in MMA due to the serious injuries they can cause. Over the course of his career, it appeared that Jon Jones' fingers were naturally drawn to the eyes of his opponents. In the tamest of his glutton of horrible out-of-the-octagon decisions, he responded to the finger-pointing accusations by mocking fans in a soon-to-be-deleted Instagram post. Like Vitor Belfort before him, Jones had an affinity for banned substances. Clearly the least manly man around. Jon Jones decided he needed to man up by taking the estrogen-blocking substance clomiphene before UFC 200. Insisting on his innocence, Jones claimed that a Cialis he took to perform in the bedroom was the culprit, not a willingness to bend the rules to be great. A man who learns from his mistakes, Jon Jones decided to take anabolic steroids before another title fight at UFC 214. His great decision-making led to his title being stripped for the third time. Maybe third time was the charm? After serving a suspension for his failed drug test at UFC 214, Jones lined up a return fight at UFC 232. You'd never guess what happened. Go on, try. You get 3 guesses. If you answered, he failed another drug test, congratulations, you win. Accusations of being a dirty fighter, failing multiple drug tests, an impressive array of legal trouble outside of MMA has led to Jon "Bone" Jones being considered one of the most prolific cheaters in UFC history. So, from using a towel to make weight to covering themselves in Vaseline, those were some of the biggest cheaters in the UFC.